Singapore Airlines is often revered to be the world's best airline.
Singapore Airlines.
Singapore Airlines.
Singapore Airlines.
Number 1. Singapore Airlines.
Ranked as the world's best carrier for nearly a decade, Singapore Air is one of the most respected brands on Earth, coming in at number 28 on Fortune's Most Admired Companies list of 2019, and that's across all industries. Since I was going to be spending 52 hours with them, I was curious to see if the hype was really all that. Now, I'm not an expert when it comes to flying aviation, but I have rode on my fair share of domestic airliners, so being able to compare the two business models should be rather interesting. Is Singapore Air worth the money? Does Asia really beat the West in quality? And will I be miserable after 26 hours of flying, even on the world's best airline? I guess we'll have to find out. The adventure begins in Houston, Texas, where I would board my first flight of 6 that made up my entire round trip to Indonesia. I would be flying to Manchester, England for a short layover before heading across the world to Singapore, the small, city-state island country located in Southeast Asia. And finally, I will have one last 3-hour flight to Bali. The first leg to the United Kingdom was not what I was most worried about. Since we would be departing at night, I planned to spend as much of the 8-hour flight as I could asleep. But then the next flight to Asia would be a whopping 12 hours. And if I could survive that, I should be able to handle the last short flight to Bali with no problem.
Reach the seat in front of you, lower your head and place it on the back of the front seat. Store your luggage under the seat in front of you.
As the plane was taking off, I was greeted by the Singapore Air in-flight safety video, which I would soon learn to memorize. Every seat in the economy class has a huge touchscreen that takes up the entire back headrest, with a bunch of really nice features and applications to keep you busy throughout the flight. My favorite was the Voyager 3D flight map, because I must have loved torturing myself as I watched our plane move across the globe pixel by pixel. I really don't recommend doing this. Just underneath the touchscreen was a detachable controller that could also be used as either a remote or a game controller. As interesting as this was, I didn't really find it very useful, but it was neat nonetheless. You also get 2 USB ports, whatever this thing is, and a headphone jack that doesn't really seem to support Apple headphones, but I found out if you just slightly plug it in, it will work just fine in just one hole. You also have a nifty tray that folds out and extends to be big enough to properly eat on. Every flight you are given a menu just after takeoff. In economy class, you always get 2 options per meal, but you can request pretty much anything that you want, as long as you submit your order 24 hours in advance. I decided to stick with what was offered. A typical meal plan for the flight would be 1 meal, 1 snack, and a second meal, each being about 3 to 4 hours apart. It is worth mentioning that everything is free, including unlimited alcohol, snacks, and toiletries, such as toothbrushes and eye shades. Part of what makes Singapore Air so notable is their intense effort to keep passengers happy, and flight attendants will frequently come by and offer you food and drink, even if you didn't ask, which is really nice. Eventually, I decided to see what sort of movies were offered. Singapore Air does a great job of offering quite a large selection of movies, but for some reason, most of them did not seem interesting, or I had already seen them. Because Singapore Air carries so many foreign passengers, you can find movie and TV selections outside Hollywood, which I did see many other people enjoying. I also discovered that the TV flips out a bit, which is super helpful if the person in front of you decides to lean back. About 2 hours into the flight, the first meal was served. This meal, I ended up with beef stroganoff with vegetables and noodles, with a side of bread, corn, tea, cheese and crackers, and red velvet cake. Even though my expectations were low, I remember this particular meal being actually really good, and I was super happy with both the quality and the quantity of the meat. This would be, however, the first of a total of 10 meals I would have on my journey to Bali and back, so my excitedness for this mealtime would slowly fade over time, but it would be fair to say that all 10 meals had the same consistent quality overall. You have probably noticed by now how empty this flight was. Luckily, I was told this 8-hour flight from Houston to Manchester is almost always only half full. My theory for this was that it was just the first part of the whole flight to Singapore, and everyone else got on when we got to the UK. As lucky as this was, the rest of the flights were nothing like this. Because I had the whole aisle to myself, I knew this would be the time to sleep, especially since we would be arriving to the UK in the morning. So I went to brush my teeth, wash my face, and made a bed with the abundance of pillows and blankets from the 2 empty seats next to me. And for the first and last time, I managed to get some sleep on board. 6 hours into the flight, I was woken up to an English breakfast, which included eggs, sausage, potatoes, yogurt, and fruit. Not bad. Since we had flown through 6 time zones, the sun was already rising, and I could tell we were getting very close to landing. After flying over the Atlantic Ocean, I could make sight of my first glimpse of land off the western coast of Ireland, and before I knew it, I was off the plane and on to the next flight. The next flight segment was what I was most worried about. Manchester to Singapore was about 13 hours, and unlike the previous flight, almost every seat was taken up, and as you can imagine, it's like sleeping on hard mode. I was surprised how well I felt after stepping off that last flight. Of course I felt a bit antsy, but I managed to keep myself entertained for the most part, and even caught a few hours of sleep. My best advice would be to find a podcast that you can binge. I recommend the Office Ladies podcast, which is a behind-the-scenes look at The Office. If you are a fan of all things Office, I cannot recommend this podcast enough. There really wasn't much different about this second flight, other than the fact it was just longer. Like I mentioned, it really wasn't that bad, and the flight attendants did a great job at staying attentive. Finally, after transiting through Changi Airport, I boarded my last flight. It was now March 3rd, and my body clock was completely wacko. It sort of felt I was living at 2 times speed. Before I knew it, I could see Indonesia out my plane window, which nearly brought tears to my eyes as my legs and butt were becoming numb. I did not expect to be served food on this flight, but they did in fact bring out a meal, which I think was lunch, but it was also about 10 in the morning and I had been awake for nearly 36 hours now, so really nothing sounded good. And just like that, I took my first step as a free man 26 hours later. That is, after going through immigration. Before I talk about my thoughts on the whole experience, I did want to mention how I spent a couple hours on the way back exploring Singapore's Changi Airport. Not surprisingly rated the #1 airport in the world, I figured it would be worth it to spend some time here exploring all the famous attractions. Believe it or not, there is actually a butterfly garden, which is completely free. Unfortunately, it was 1 in the morning when I visited, so most of the butterflies were asleep, but I was okay with that, since I've always been a little skeptical of butterflies anyway. There were so many luxury retailers here, I'm not sure how the average person could even shop. I've always wondered what kind of person shops Gucci in the airport, but then again, I'm also over here drinking out of the public water fountain. And yes, there is also a movie theater in this airport too. I did hang out here for a bit, and just like everything else, it was also free. This is probably the only airport in the world I would be fine with a delayed flight. Changi Airport is even nicer than most malls I've been to. The 26 hours of flights back to Houston, Texas was by far the worst part, specifically the last 2 flight segments. As I was getting ready for departure in Bali, I was feeling really confident since I managed so well coming here. But by that night, I had really began to feel it. In a way, time became sort of meaningless since we were zooming through time zone after time zone backwards. The longest flight segment, which was 14 hours, I was stuck next to a fairly large passenger and felt cramped the entire time. If I slept on the flight at all, I really couldn't tell. As we approached the United States, this was where sleep deprivation really began to kick in. It was mid-afternoon in the States, so the cabin crew had all the lights on to help acclimate to the local time. But no amount of light or music is going to help me when I had been up for nearly 40 hours straight. Towards the end, I became so tired that I actually remember having a conversation with one of the flight attendants, only to realize that I had been hallucinating and talking to nothing. The more I tried to sleep, the more I would just doze off and hallucinate, unable to drown out all the light and noise and turbulence over the Appalachian Mountains. But as I look back on the whole experience, I guess you do get what you pay for. For spending 52 hours in economy class, I guess it could have been much worse. I hate to say it, but there is really nothing else I could have possibly wanted to make this journey easier, besides upgrading of course. If riding in the best economy class was as tiring as this, I definitely do not want to know what the average economy flight experience would be like for this long. Overall, I would say Singapore Air met my expectations, and was absolutely an upgrade from the average carrier. But with that being said, I would not pay a premium to ride Singapore Air if there would have been a cheaper option. But if Singapore appears to be your best option, the slightly marked up price tag definitely won't disappoint.